Hello, and welcome to Day 2 of Compact 22, A Better Way Forward, Innovation with Equity at the Center. Yesterday was a tremendous day full of great presentations from our colleagues and the ability to learn with and from some great people. Now we turn our attention to another day packed with opportunities to learn and connect with one another. We will kick off the morning in a few minutes with a panel discussion. Then we'll transition to breakout sessions. After that, we'll have more time for you to choose your own adventure. You can join in a face-to-face conversation by grabbing a seat in one of our networking lounges. We'll also have a new slate of facilitated discussions in the rooms. For today, we've made joining those discussions a little bit easier than they were yesterday, so there's nothing in the way of a great conversation. We'll close the day with more breakout sessions and end with Impact in Action, a celebration of the 2022 recipients of the Campus Compact Impact Awards. I want to give another shout out and thank you to all of our great sponsors: Compact to Learn, Up to Us, the Ronald Reagan Foundation and Institute, Give Pulse, and Swarthmore College. It is my pleasure to introduce today's plenary panel. This panel is grounded in Richard Guarasci's most recent book, Neighborhood Democracy: Building Anchor Partnerships Between Colleges and Their Community. Let me tell you a little bit about his book to set the context. From its origins, the mission of American higher education was to promote democratic governance and a free, fair, and orderly society through the education of responsible citizens. Just as its mission has become more urgent, it is being undermined as colleges and universities find themselves trapped in a fiscal crisis that threatens their very institutional viability. A crisis in large part brought about by the very perpetuation of economic and racial inequity and the consequent erosion of consensus about civic purpose and vision. This book argues that higher education can and must again take leadership in promoting the participatory processes and instilling the democratic values needed to build a vibrant and fair society. Guarasci offers a model of civic mission and engagement whereby, through relatively modest investment, colleges can develop reciprocal partnerships with local institutions, civic, and business groups to raise the quality and outcomes of K-12 education, promote local entrepreneurship and community involvement, raise incomes, and increase the attainment of postsecondary education to benefit the wider national economy and colleges around the region and country. He demonstrates how civic engagement can revitalize communities and generate developmental and foundation funding. Vividly illustrated by the examples of success of students from the shadow community to which Wagner College committed its energies and resources, by the stories of the local schools and their principals, and the voices of local partners, this book offers a compelling and detailed account of what it takes to transform an institution and a neighborhood, and a model of renewal. So now, we are all ready for a great panel and discussion to follow. Join me as I introduce our three panelists for this session. First is a longtime friend of Campus Compact, our former board chair and president emeritus of Wagner College, Richard Guarasci. Dr. Guarasci is also a founder and principal of Presidential Partners, LLC. Next, we have Dr. Nyeema Watson, who serves as both Vice President for University Community Engagement with Rutgers University System and Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Inclusion, and Civic Engagement at Rutgers University-Camden. And finally, we have Bobbie Laur, who, as you know, has recently joined Compact as our new president, but when she was asked to be on this panel, was the executive director for the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities and the associate vice president for outreach at Towson University. Welcome to all of you. Everyone watching, we will have time for Q&A at the end of the session, so please direct your questions to the questions tab in the chat feature. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Nicole, so much. And thank you, Nyeema and Bobbie, for being on the panel. I want to say before I get started that I invite the audience to consider themselves as part of a larger conversation that we're all having. The three of us are friends and have worked together for years, and we consider everyone in the audience here as our equals whatever level of organization you sit in or in your communities, you are practitioners in this work of building a vibrant, inclusive, dynamic, just, equitable democracy. That's the work we're about, and that's what we want to talk about today, and the situation we find ourselves in at this moment in 2022, post-pandemic, or at least this part of the pandemic. So let me just start by saying that I thank you, Nicole, for this wonderful introduction. We are in an acute moment of political and economic despair and crisis, and it is imperative that the civic mission of higher education be renewed and extended at this very moment. First of all, the crisis of democracy, if it ever was, present and visible to us, it is now, given the dynamics within the United States itself, from the presidency of Trump and the attack on democracy and democratic institutions and on communities of color and of class, to the attempts to stifle school boards and teachers and learners from finding out the truth about the kinds of situations they've encountered throughout our American history, and resetting the questions and resetting the narrative, all the way through what we see worldwide in terms of the crisis in Ukraine internationally and the attack on democracy, and what I'll use as an old term, liberal democracy, that is to say, open societies. So we know that for sure. But on top of, and so the civic mission of higher education is right there, critical in terms of developing a generation of transformative leaders. But secondly, we are in another crisis of acute inequality and institutional racism. I don't have to go through all the data for this audience, but clearly, let's just say, look at two facts that just strike us. Well, three facts, really. The level of income inequality now rivals what it was before the advent of the federal income tax around 1914, prior to World War I. Think about that. We are more unequal today than we were then. After all the social networks that have been put in place, all the transfer of authority to organizations and protocols and policies to equalize our society, we're less equal. Secondly, we're living through an educational system, K through 12, that is nothing short of educational apartheid. I live in New York City. New York City now is more segregated in its school system in 2022 than it was in 1956, when Brown versus the Board of Education was declared by the Supreme Court that separate but equal would not stand. Another factoid to that point: if you're an African-American boy, not on the fourth grade reading level, by the beginning of the fourth grade, your chances of incarceration sometime in your life go up 80%. 80%. So we don't like to think of reading as destiny, but it has become destiny in many ways. So the acute crisis, and of course, we're talking about a system of institutional racism, not a prejudice, not a bigotry, a system where the distribution of power and economic resources disproportionately leaves out Black and brown and white working class communities. That's the inevitable situation we find ourselves in. So the crisis of democracy, the crisis of inequality and institutional racism, and then couple that with the crippling crisis that most of our institutions in higher education find ourselves in, a fiscally short and challenged situation where net revenue for most institutions is flat, where enrollment is stagnating, and certainly in the Northeast and through other parts of the country, and where, very noticeably, Black and brown communities are disproportionately left out of the college equation. So these three pieces converge in this book that I've written called Neighborhood Democracy. And we've tried to put together anchor partnerships with our communities in K through 16 pipelines. And Nyeema and Bobbie know this work well, and many of you are involved in this work in the audience. But I re-envision this work when that kind of work is done in a substantive way with resilience and consistency. We are building not just K through 16 pipelines, we're building democratic units within communities that have been marginalized and left out of the political equation in most of the places where they exist. So those are the key things that I want to talk about in larger vein of where we are. But we thought we would start off more generously, since this is a conversation which we want to have with you and amongst ourselves, by talking about our own personal journeys of how we've gotten to the place of doing this work. And let's focus on that a little bit. And they've asked me to start this. I wanted to go third, but they asked me to start this. So I'll just say this quickly, because I really am, at this point, committed to the fact that we're trying to build not only a generation of transformational leaders, but ourselves continue to have the resiliency and the knowledge to continue to work together towards building that kind of interracial democratic culture and reality. So I started way back in 1973 when none of you were born as a visiting instructor at St. Lawrence University. I had no idea if I wanted to stay in higher education. I had come out of the civil rights movements and the anti-war movements. I was married and was having a baby. We were having a baby on the way, and I had the intelligence as a visiting instructor, which, the title instructor was bad enough, but visiting instructor meant don't unpack your bags. You won't be here next year. And in that first semester, I sat in on the president's office with our students to get co-ed housing. So, I was a bit of a lunatic to start off with. But my point is, all the way through the journey of well over 40 some odd years in higher education, be it a faculty member, a director, a provost, a dean, a president for a long time, my role always was to build a notion of interracial democracy and a just one, and always build the civic mission out of higher education to connect with communities and organize itself appropriately and educate students so they learn the arts of democracy. Everything from critical thinking and developing their own voice to being able to understand the nature of evidence and argument, to learning how to have empathy and reciprocity, listen, learn from others, hear their stories, build coalitions, and ultimately take actions. So that was my goal. And my point of all of this personal story is, no matter where you sit in your organization, where you sit in the configuration of things and where the spaces where you're working, if you're committed to this work, you are a leader. And never let your location, however limited it may be in terms of access to those at the very tops of organizations, limit you in thinking about how to play a critical role in advancing this work. It's about ultimately having resiliency, vision, resiliency, and good humor will get you to where you have to go. So with that, I'll turn it to Nyeema to tell what is an incredible story of her own journey.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today with you and Bobbie. I think for many on the call on these screens who know the three of us, know that I count you as colleagues, as mentors, as friends, dear friends, and we've had these conversations over the years, so I'm happy to have them here today. And I'm really excited to have this conversation in relation to your book that is sitting right here by me, because the core of this book is so timely. And as I thought about it in relation to what we were going to talk about today, it really talks about the thrust of my own work here at Rutgers-Camden and these thinkings that I've had about the space of higher education and civic engagement. So for me, I sit at this intersection and really an overlap of diversity, equity, and inclusion and civic engagement. I've always been deeply passionate about DEI work and civic engagement, even before I knew what civic engagement really was. But I knew when I started in this space, if civic engagement initiatives were not built on and tied to addressing the inequities, racialized inequities that Richard was talking about, that came to be because of systemic racism in the city of Camden, where Rutgers-Camden is situated, then our work would be meaningless. And it would be meaningless because we did not get our students especially, but also our faculty and our staff to think critically about the how of Camden. So not just to drive in every day, come to campus and leave, but as you're driving in and you're seeing and you're experiencing the city, how did Camden come to be the way it is today? And how could we, through our efforts here at Rutgers-Camden, come to address some of these things? And not address them simply as a higher education institution, but address them in partnership with those who live daily life experience here in Camden. So how can we address inequities in meaningful ways that was going to have a long-term positive impact, not just on the faculty member, the student, or the staff person, but equally impactful on the community members, the residents, and the stakeholders here in the city of Camden. So again, when I came to this work, I didn't have a formal sense of what it was, but when I was an undergraduate student here at Rutgers-Camden in the mid-90s, great time, I always felt that the university could and should do more. I was a first-generation student. I was from the city of Camden. I was here at Rutgers-Camden, but I knew nothing of this place prior to the weeks before I stepped onto this campus. I really didn't even have an idea that a university existed in the city of Camden. But what I did know was that this institution was separate and apart from this city. Residents and young people were not invited into the campus. They were not welcomed. There were very few efforts at the time when I was a student here. I could count on one hand that had any tie to the city. So I questioned this as a student when I started to volunteer in the city because I felt it was important. I felt it was meaningful to give back to my city. But I couldn't reconcile how this institution that I was at, this institution, this place of knowledge creation and sharing knowledge, could sit back and not deal with the deep inequities that existed in the city of Camden. And they were literally all around the campus. So how could we not be dealing with the challenged K-12 education system? How could we not be dealing with economic disinvestment, crime, poverty, public safety, health inequities? Driving to this campus, you saw that on a regular. Reading anything about the city, you knew that existed. But these were not things that Rutgers cared about at the time. So again, if universities were supposed to be this bastion of knowledge, which is what you learn as a student, and that college exists for the public good, why did they not use this in relation to their relationship with the city of Camden? But I also came to realize while my upbringing and education in Camden was really centered around Black and Latino experiences, that's all I knew. I also came to this place as a campus and it was full of white people. And I was like, where did they come from? Why don't I see them every day? So it was this really kind of drying experience. But then also I realized that here was an institution of people who had wholly negative experiences of the city of Camden, writ large, that they came to this place of the university and they left, and what they knew of Camden kind of existed outside of it. So all of this experience, all of this history, I bring it to my work here. I joined Rutgers Camden 17 years ago. We launched the Office of Civic Engagement, 12 years ago. And my thinking has just been sharpened over the past couple of years as I moved our Office of Civic Engagement into this division of diversity, equity, and civic engagement. So I get to lead this work here on our campus. I get to sit at the leadership table where I can bring the best of what we know about university community of partnerships, anchor work, place-based, hyperlocal initiatives. All of these approaches play into how we do our work here at Rutgers Camden. How do we think critically about the role of the university, its presence, its assets, human assets, intellectual, physical, and create mutually beneficial partnerships and relationships with residents, community leaders, stakeholders, to address their deep concerns for their community, but also in ways that are going to better society. And so as we've kind of thought about our work and we've made this shift, we now, and my job is to making sure that we hold racial equity and social justice at the center of our work. So we'll talk about over our time today the K-12 pipeline work we've done, our certificate in civic engagement and social change, our critically engaged civic learning. Shout out to Nyeema Mitchell for coming and working with us on that. Our local procurement efforts, all of these efforts we have here at Rutgers Camden now are really focused on not only how do we build this better relationship, but do it in equitable and inclusive ways. And so I get the honor and privilege of somebody from the city of Camden, educated twice over. Basically, I live on campus. I own a home here a couple of blocks away. But I really want to have this time for us to kind of talk about, how are we doing this work right now in the midst of all of these challenges as a society, and asking everyone here today to kind of recommit to these democratic ideals and these intersections that you talk about in the book. So thank you for allowing me to introduce myself, and I'll turn it over to Bobbie.
Thanks, Nyeema. Good morning again. I appreciated Nicole's framing around how I ended up on this panel, because I will say to my team and to my friends, I was pretty conscious of, the Compact crew just saw me yesterday. But as I mentioned, this was in the works prior to stepping into this new capacity with Compact. And Richard and Nyeema and I have had these conversations, as said, over really 10, 15 years of working together. And so I think we're all thrilled to be coming together in community today. So I think, Richard, the question was the personal story that got us into this work. So from my end of things, I think in parallel to Nyeema, it's a bit about an evolution of the work and how I've seen my capacity within the various institutions I served kind of grow as the field has changed, and really grown into itself, I think, in many ways. So my work at an institutional level, there's been a commonality. In multiple institutions, they've always been state normal schools. That's been a huge part of their history, right? So they've been grounded in teacher preparation. So much of my work, I would say, for the first decade of being a community engagement professional was really focused on that K-12 relationship. Now, different than I would say how we're thinking about college access and success. A lot of it was about how do we as an institution connect to local school systems, and how do we think about bringing the assets of our institution into that, whether it was through tutoring, teacher preparation, all of the components that go into those K-12 relationships. But I think it was about 12 years ago that we saw a shift, at least at Towson University, where I was, where we started thinking less about the projects and the partnerships, and we started really taking a step back and thinking about how those things connected. What was the larger impact we were having, and how did we, like many of us all talk about in higher ed, kind of break down silos? How did we begin to really take a step back and think about our work in a more strategic way? Personally, another thing that came into that play about that time, maybe, aging myself, maybe it was more like 15 years ago, thinking about my kids' ages, is I was sitting on local improvement committees within Baltimore City in my neighborhood. And there was no recognition of higher ed being at the table. We weren't even, nobody was talking about how universities had a critical role to play in the Main Street development and how we were thinking about equitable development. And it was at that same time that I was doing a lot of reading around what was coming out of the Democracy Collaborative. That was talking about this notion of community wealth building. And today, in post-COVID, it's never been more relevant. It goes back to what Richard just talked about. The massive racial gaps that we are facing now, and that statistic that you just shared, Richard, that I hadn't heard, related just to give us a framing of before, where we're sitting today and how much loss we've had in terms of development in that space. And so I was struck by, where are we showing up in these conversations? Where are we showing up in the conversations that are about the deindustrialization of our cities? That our cities, and particularly large urban communities, have lost major industry. And where's higher ed in that? And particularly, where's community engagement offices in that? How are we stretching ourselves, thinking beyond the practices at that point that were really core and continue to be foundational components of engaged teaching, learning, and service learning? But how are we thinking broader about that? And I will say that connects probably to how I landed into this role, is because I really started looking towards national networks. At the time, I was also leading Kumu, and these national networks and working with colleagues at Compact were critical in helping all of us reimagine and think about how community engagement leaned into this thing called economic inclusion. That when I really think back, this again, it's language, right? This is not terminology we were using 12, 15 years ago. It's really been in the past decade. And so I would say, my journey to this conversation, has really been about how we broaden our work and how we think about extending the table of players both on our campus and in our communities. I've done my homework, Richard. I've got the book right here, and I was struck by, one of your components here where you talk about, as American cities continue to suffer the severe disinvestment, where was higher education? And I think that has been a real huge component for me in my journey of thinking about our work. And I mentioned it yesterday, how community engagement is absolutely at the right moment to play probably the most critical role as our institutions come out of this pandemic and think about what it means to be a publicly engaged institution in 2022 and what that impact is, and holistically. And I just want to say, I think we've all benefited from having community with each other. This work is hard. And as we start this conversation, I think it's important. It's messy and it's difficult and it's a journey and it's a lot of ups and downs, because it's a lot of community meetings. It's a lot of sitting there and really being the recipient of very appropriate calls for change and challenge about where our institutions have caused harm and where there's been inaction. And I will say that I think I have really appreciated the late night calls, with my colleagues here, and the early morning conversations that we've all had as we've tried to kind of prepare ourselves for this next conversation we're going to be having, or how we're thinking about both an internal or an external challenge. So I think that's been my journey to today, and just have a lot of gratitude for the both of you and so many who I know are also with us today in community at the conference that have really been there for each other as we've really tried to address and shift our institutions.
Great, thanks, Bobbie. And so we want to get into more dialogue with each other and start from the beginning. The title of this session is called "Being Anchors in the Storm," and the past 2 years have really shifted and changed us, not simply just as individuals, but as professionals, as leaders within institutions of higher education or associations. So can we think about, what has this shift meant? Where are we right now? Dealing with a global pandemic, dealing with a racial reckoning, dealing with this uncertainty in higher education. Not only are people, the voices are getting louder, questioning the importance of a 4-year degree, questioning the expense of it, and the rate of return. So can we give some thought to, and we'll start with Richard, where are we at right now? And what must we do to address all of these challenges?
So, Nyeema, let me just pick it up there. So I became president of Wagner College in 2002, and I'm moving from the position of provost, with a long history in higher ed. And I determined that the reason to be president was to position Wagner educationally in a way where it could live up to its mission. It's a typical liberal arts college. It had been founded by Lutherans. It was no longer a Lutheran institution 30 or 40 years earlier, but it still had in its bones a civic mission. And I wanted to first, as the president, champion my students and all their opportunities and their successes. I wanted to support my faculty and all the folks on the staff who were responsible for learning in that regard. And I wanted to commit ourselves to the civic mission of the institution, both locally and nationally. And in the local work, we sought out, we were doing a lot of civic engagement, like a lot of institutions were at that point, maybe some still are, a lot of scattered work. We had a lot of civic engagement work, a lot of student involvement in different kinds of communities of need all around the borough of Staten Island, which is, for those not familiar, is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. It's the smallest borough. It's just shy of 500,000 people, but it is bigger than the city of Cleveland, of Oakland, so on, Detroit, and so on and so forth, but small by the other 8 million people in New York City. And by the way, New York City, for all the time that I've been there, well over now 30 years, I think this is a statistic I can give you. Think about this, and this is not, I think, unique to New York, is that 50% of all the children born for each of the last 20 plus years, let's say for sure, I think it's 30 years, 50% of the children are born to mothers who have not been born in the United States. So the level of diversity and immigration added to the existing populations within New York was very demanding. And so I searched around once we put together a curriculum in place when I was provost and later solidified as president, called the Wagner Plan for the Practical Liberal Arts, which kind of reconciled the programs of liberal education, liberal learning, liberal arts with all the professional applied areas. I wanted them to understand that there were 2 ways to learn and grow as students, and they needed each other. They needed both parts of that equation to be vibrant, what I call civic professionals. That was my goal, that if you graduate from Wagner College, you would become a civic professional. Whatever your chosen career would be, you would know that there's a civic component to that work. If you're in the helping professions, teaching, healthcare, so on and so forth, it was obvious. If you're in the more secular professions like business, there was always a notion that there was a civic component to the work of helping aggregate capital and resources for communities, whether you did it at work or you did it in your private life as a member of your community. But once we put that curriculum in play, a 4-year curriculum for all of our undergraduates, I then turned to more specifically to the civic mission and found that we were spending a lot of time in scattershot activities. And it was more about voyeurism than it was about transformation. That is to say, it was well-intended work. It was transformative for individual students being engaged with individuals and communities that they could work with in food pantries and all the different agencies and organizations that we were working with, schools and the like. but it wasn't moving the needle on the equation of inequality. The coefficients of inequality weren't changing at all in these communities. So with all this labor, with all this social capital, what we're doing? So we carefully chose one community 2 miles from the campus called Port Richmond, which was largely undocumented Mexicans from Oaxaca, another 20% or so African Americans, the rest white working class New Yorkers. We chose to ally with that community, become of that community and with that community, and they would be of our campus. They weren't sending very many students, if any, to Wagner College. It was that's that interesting relationship that Bobbie talks about. Where are we, in the game? And long story short, and it's well documented in the book, and I talk about a lot of different institutional anchor partnerships at Rutgers-Camden, at Rutgers-Newark, at Augsburg, and endless schools I talk about in the book. To use the Wagner example, we built this Port Richmond partnership. We said, look, let's find the areas where we can be successful with the community, and the community has equal needs. And we found that we're in healthcare, they were in educational opportunity, they were in economic development, they were in economic justice, and they were in the arts and public history. And those were the places that was a real need. And the community had documented that through an assessment program that we did with an outside source. So we began to literally sign documents saying we're committed to each other. We put together a Port Richmond partnership. We were able to get a significant amount of grant money, as well as redeploy some of our own diversity money towards growing our own. That is to say, we were going to go into this community with the community and focus on, ultimately we started with the high school and worked downward. We didn't start with the elementary school, and build, like many of you on the call, as well as on, of course, those of us on the panel, built, serious relationships with this community in terms of transformation, as well as personal improvement. And we built a pipeline of elementary school, which was PS 21, which was in Port Richmond, which fed to intermediate school IS 51, which more or less fed to, for the most part, to Port Richmond High School. And with the three principals, the college community, through the president's office, all the way down through the faculty and the administration and staff, and the students, of course, key students like many of our Bonner scholars and so on and so forth, and other students in various civic organizations on campus, committed to this work with the pipeline piece, which was the kind of backbone of our partnership. But we're also heavily in healthcare. Our nursing and PA programs and pre-med programs were very heavily involved in working with providing resources in this community that had very limited resources, particularly with undocumented immigrants who felt very, very, very frightened of any kind of authorities. And worked with the hospitals to bring them closer to these communities as well, and with all the nonprofits in healthcare. We worked a lot with immigration justice, with El Centro de Migrante and La Coloma, to work with folks to get justice, to get paid, to begin to learn languages, to find ways to do healthcare, on and on and on. It was just remarkable work. And the same with public history and voice, of providing cultural outlets and letting the community tell its story in a variety of ways, on campus and off campus and throughout the Staten Island community, including the Eric Garner story, which happened just a few miles from us down the road on Staten Island. All of that said, we were rolling. We had a program called the Port Richmond Leadership Academy, which funded intense, not only summer programs for students who were between 75 and 82 GPAs in high school, to get involved both civically, educationally, taking courses for credit from college professors, not full-time college professors, in their sophomore, junior, and senior years, so they could actually have a semester of college done before they started in the educational pipeline piece. But they were learning lots about the arts and of democracy, of the history and politics of American democracy, its limitations, as well as its opportunities, and history of success in certain ways, and its limitations and drawbacks and contradictions in other ways. But they were being prepared to take a civic role, and they were actively engaged in their own community. So all of that said, that work was blossoming. We had 48 students go through that program, and over several years, and all but one went to college. These were students who had no background in college, no preparation for college. Their families had no understanding. They're quite frightened of college. They thought it would be taking their children away from them, so on and so, the usual stories. So lots of success. I then retired from Wagner in 2019 after 17 years as president. I was the longest serving president in the college. I believed that we had a good infrastructure to support all this work, leadership change at the presidential level and throughout, changes in the community, retirements of principals and other leaders in the community from all the factions that we had put together, this large coalition. And the pandemic hit. And so the pandemic hit, which essentially ceased a lot of the, if not all of the field work, in-field work of tutoring and mentoring and civic engagement, and leadership development, of providing services directly with the community. All of that went haywire. And with a new leadership core, which was not necessarily authored this work. So, it became a point of dislocation, like on many of our campuses, of people who had worked together on campus and with the community being torn from each other because they couldn't be with each other easily. I was very impressed with Sharon's comments yesterday on one of the opening panels about how Rutgers Newark, which is a model of all these schools, which has really thought through that, trying to use virtual relationships as limited as they can be, but at least continue some of the work and some of the direct engagement. So I think that's one of the real challenges we now anchors in the storm is I'm now involved, even though I don't live on Staten Island at the moment, but I was not going to abandon this community. And my former partners in this work, both in the community and on campus, were not going to abandon this community. So we have now been trying to rebuild all those partnerships back again. We're not sure we're going to have a single academic lead anchor. We might have multiple anchors from big anti-poverty organizations, Catholic Charities, Wagner College, a few others who might join as multiple anchors in a different kind of model, maybe a 501c3. We're not sure if that'll work or just create more competition amongst the 501c3s who are part of our partners for grant money. All those contradictions have to be sorted out. But we're in the process of rebuilding because the pandemic stole a lot of the momentum, and the leadership changes created new challenges for us in rebuilding commitments and in ways that were sustainable. I'll talk more about maybe at the end of this conversation about why all of this work is not only critically imperative politically, socially, morally, but why it's economically imperative for higher education to be involved in this work. But I'll save that for others. So we find ourselves in a moment in that one instance, and I think across the country, of having to rebuild the relationships which were stolen from us by the pandemic.
I agree, Richard. That's exactly exactly what we faced here at Rutgers Camden. You know, you build these over the course of 12 years, these relationships with particular principals and kids and their families. You know, we too have a pipeline approach. We work with students beginning in grade 3. We work to keep them until they get to and through Rutgers. We support them in paying for their college tuition and all of the other social and emotional supports that they have. But the pandemic really gutted us in the sense that Camden was a hotspot, the city of Camden. So there was nothing we could do in person for close to 2 years. Our staff, which is, you know, deeply emotionally invested in this work, were dealing with their own personal challenges. The kids and the families, it was access to that technology, access to, you know, how many tablets do you need in the house with 5 kids if you don't have, you know, proper internet? And so we tried to really, you know, stay true and committed to this work, but it was really, really hard. And so set that against the backdrop of what, you know, research is telling us now and what many of us are seeing in schools, that, you know, especially for Black and brown kids, they have lost years of education. They have to deal with the social and emotional kind of lingering impacts of losing family members and losing classmates to COVID, still feeling this sense of unease. And so that's the space where we're at right now in Rutgers Camden. We had all these great models, these great approaches. The kids did not like being online. Their parents did not like being online, but our relationships mattered. So thankfully, we just received a congressional appropriation to jumpstart our work. We received about $235,000 to go into the schools and do some deep work in person on academic remediation and social and emotional supports. But we showed up in other ways. And so we couldn't do that. But we know our nursing schools did work, our law school clinics did work, you know, responding uniquely to the pandemic with the assets and resources we had, but that commitment on behalf of the university mattered, and that leadership. Because if we didn't have that, we could have easily, I think, moved in a direction of not having this work being sustained. But, again, when Bobbie's talking about like late nights and early morning conversations, we had a lot. We sat in spaces together, kind of thinking about like, what are you doing right now? And we showed up, the higher eds who were committed to this work. And so, turning it back over to Bobbie, like talk to us about, so that we don't leave people in a sense of despair, but we know that, for institutions committed to this anchor mission, to these place-based efforts, that they were really able to double down on that work and see through new opportunities of engaging with their local communities.
Yeah, I'm struck by, look, anchors in the storm. This has been a really tough couple years. And I mean, I think there's lots of directions to take that, so we can talk about what were some glimmers of hope, like where was higher ed in a position to play a value-added role? You just started talking about it. And there are a plethora of examples. Everybody who is here today has examples of where their institution showed up. And I'm sure we're going to see lots of research and scholarship come out of this that are going to talk about how were different institutions more prepared, structured, strategically oriented to be the most impactful. And so this is not grounded in the research that hasn't been done yet. But I'm excited to see what comes of the field of this. And it's a set of questions that we need to dive into. But one of them, I think, is about institutions that have for a long time been putting resources and investment on neighborhood level hyperlocal approaches. And what we mean by that is it may be a physical space. We have campuses all across the country that have neighborhood centers, and the ones that jump to mind are, Drexel and the University of Pittsburgh that were early adopters of this approach. University of Nebraska Omaha has some great work. These are place-based centers in community. We're recognizing Kent, Cup, and Seattle University later today in the Impact Awards for the work they've been doing for decades in Seattle and the network that they've helped birth around place-based justice network. So those institutions, I think, I want to shine a light on because they were uniquely prepared when COVID hit to be really responsive. And what did that mean? It meant, one, they were trusted messengers. We heard a lot about what it took to be a trusted messenger when we talked about vaccines, particularly in communities of color. Who was going to be the right messenger to help validate and share experiences and help raise the vaccination rates? In those communities, and this is again just stories from partners of saying they've been in there, they have the relationships, the neighborhoods, they show up on front doors, people trust them. And so they were more prepared to help, whether it was needing the digital equity devices, as Nyeema talked about. It was meeting people where they were. We had institutions that were able to stay open when everything else closed, that their neighborhood centers were allowed to keep their doors open and help provide critical sources around food insecurity. The digital equity piece cannot be understated. We had a lot of institutions that showed up on the housing front during COVID. And it's like in multiple frames. It was thinking about the housing insecurity that our own students, faculty, and staff are facing, particularly adjunct and lecturer positions, which there's a depth of research that talks about, particularly in high market urban communities, the housing insecurity for that population. We know across our campuses, the rising issue of housing insecurity among our students is huge. So our campuses leaned into that. But many of these hyperlocal institutions also leaned into what it meant to support rent or eviction moratoriums, advocacy work, boots on the ground of helping to go door to door. I feel like we could go on and on. Like there's a lot of things that institutions showed up in, but then there's also a lot of things that were paused, and there's questions of how they're going to restart. A glaring one is that we had institutions across our country adopting this economic inclusion model, which was really grounded in hiring and purchasing. How are universities thinking about those key business practices from an engagement perspective? How are they thinking about who they hire, how their hiring takes place, how that they can really address wealth and income inequities in their cities through that, and similarly procurement. Where are we buying our paper from? And all of that work takes time, getting relationships built between key community engagement officers and the procurement departments, understanding who your vendors are, understanding your supply chain. These are not easy things that can be done overnight. And unfortunately, over the 2 years, much of that work just completely paused. We've lost staff in those departments. I know I hear from colleagues all the time that are like, no one's left in procurement that was there when I was doing this. So they're hitting the restart button. Universities were not purchasing any of those sort of goods that were easier entry points, that are more our food, supplies that have been entry points for thinking about engaged purchasing. Same thing with hiring. Our institutions have been, we have many campuses across the country that are still dealing with trying to come back and layoffs, let alone being in a position to hire. So that's been one of the harder things to see is, you just feel like you're making traction. And again, it's time. It's not something that happens overnight. And COVID just really bent it down. And the other thing I want to say that happened during COVID for all of us is the mental exhaustion and the mental health crisis that all of us in the field have been navigating, but then we've been like we didn't want to be an additional burden, right? Like doing community engagement work, helping to build partnerships takes time. And I think I've heard from colleagues who have said, I didn't want to add something to somebody's plate. Last thing I wanted at this point is be like, can you engage in this conversation when they're trying to keep their doors open if they're a partner? So I think there was that piece that's also been lost. But I want to offer a glimmer of where I think we have to be focused, which is not trying to go back to where we were 2 years ago. And I think a lot of it is taking this moment to reframe. Who are the partners? Where is the depth of work? How do we think about how we enter those conversations? Yesterday's dialogue around power dynamics, how do we reframe how we are a part of the solution versus, the drivers? We have a window to, I think, reimagine collectively how our institutions show up in community and in cities and in neighborhoods and really start anew in this moment that I think is really important. But I think it's what we need to talk about is the sustaining piece. Richard, you touched on it with Wagner. It's tough. It's tough to hear. And we hear this all the time, campuses and communities where it's like, they've got the office. Things seem like they're institutionalized. And then whether it's a leadership change, a lot happening during COVID. But how do we ensure that this work is sticky, that it is baked into the institution? And this is, I think, for all of us, the question that at least for me comes up the most. How do we bake this in? How do we ensure that this is going to last beyond a dynamic leader or a strategic plan? So I don't know, Nyeema, if you want to dive in on, how do we keep this work centered?
Yeah, it has to be intentional work throughout building as you're thinking about the model of the work that you're doing externally, and you're thinking about the model of who are you engaging internally in your institutions to do this work. You have to think very, very structurally about how you start to deeply embed this into your higher education institution. I think one of the most powerful things that we were able to do here at Rutgers-Camden, and it's also mirrored in our colleagues at Newark, is that I sit at the leadership table of the university, of the entirety of the campus. My role is to think about, every time I'm at that table, how is this action, whatever it is, going to impact the city in which we're situated in? How do we deeply think about how all of this work needs to be embedded into the academic curriculum? Not just, taking a course, an engaged civic learning, a service learning course because it's nice. How do we deeply get it into the curriculum? How do we deeply, engage our students in ways where it's tied to their co-curricular experiences? How do we build these relationships with the community that are really hard to get out of after you've been doing it for a few years? So for us, it was, making sure that our faculty saw the value in our engaged civic learning, surveying our students, looking at the data and what their pre and post surveys were telling us. And our faculty, who were skeptical in the beginning, started to see through our evaluative efforts that this was meaningful for our students, but it was also transformative for them and their pedagogical approaches. They added it into our gen ed requirements. So as a student, now you leave Rutgers-Camden, you will have to take one of these courses. For our Bonner Civic Scholars Program, it's embedded into our budget. We are seeking students at Rutgers-Camden. We are marketing ourselves as a place where you want to learn about civic professionalism, you want to make change like right now, come to Rutgers-Camden. We have scholarships for it. We train our faculty to do this work. We sit on boards in the community, not only the staff of our office, but our faculty and other leaders. And then as we really sought to, respond to this racial reckoning, I had been in conversations with our past chancellors about like DEI is at the core of our work. Like, how are we thinking about this as a campus? And so now to have restructured our work to align more clearly and visibly for others, because it was always clear to me and internally that now we are attached to our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, like that increases the sustainability and it puts it back into this core that Richard talks about, that as we think about this present state of higher education, of recommitting to these democratic ideals, especially for urban and metropolitan universities, you have to look right outside your door and the inequity exists. So how are you seeking to address that? Not only as, a good thing to do business-wise because you're going to bring more Black and brown kids in, but as an imperative for who you are as an institution. So all of these things went into us really deeply embedding this work into the fabric, into the fiber of who we are. And I will also say our work, and again, I'm always going to give credit to our colleagues at Rutgers Newark. I believe our work pushed the university president to embed this in our DEI strategy. Community engagement is one of our strategies of the 5 for our diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. Now, this is moving our other colleagues in different ways because all of our campuses have this work, but really to think about how this is a lockstep with each other. And so as you're kind of building the effort, thinking about where this fits in the deep core and mission and values of your institution is important, and then making those changes so that when leaders change, we've had 3 chancellors, our core work is still here. It would be very, very hard, not impossible, but for them to take this apart. But you have to kind of build that and be intentional about it along the way. Richard?
So thank you. And by the way, Nyeema, I want to just reinforce something that's intimate to your own work, which is that the DEI work and the civic work now are connected in ways that we had never even imagined before. And that's what drove me to neighborhood democracy, and reconceptualization of the anchor work, not as just a partnership, but as helping communities build a democratic culture for themselves of participation and engagement and action, where the community itself begins to relearn the arts of democracy, of building coalitions and mediating differences and building a sense of empathy and reciprocity and leadership, resilient leadership. But I wanted to say that, as I said in the beginning, in sustaining the work, so let me get at the micro level here, and I'll take it from the position of an institution and a president. People tend to think, well, the president, he or she determines the nature of this work or the commitment to the work. And that's true. But wherever you are in the organization or even in the community, there are arguments that influence presidents and leaders of institutions, senior leadership. So I want to focus on this because it's the ignored piece of the conversation usually. It is in the economic interests of higher education as a sector and institutions, particularly that are enrollment sensitive, which is about 90% of our institutions of higher education, that they build these kinds of pipeline models for sure. Because enrollment and demographics show us that things are going to fray, if they haven't already frayed rather dramatically in institutions. They are enrollment sensitive. But we have low college attendance from Black and brown and white working class neighborhoods. So the commitment to neighborhood democracy and anchor partnerships and K through 12 pipelines is in the material naked self-interest of these institutions. And what do I mean by that? What arguments can I give folks in the audience to command the attention of their leaders? One, enrollment is the key to revenue for most institutions. And we know that civic engagement work increases the retention, the performance, and the completion rates of students on campus. If you ask the CFOs of your campus, that means revenue increases because tuition dollars increase and all the things that support tuition dollars in terms of aid dollars coming into the campus. That's number one. So that's absolutely critical. Number two, student learning increases for the students involved on the campus side, right? And we know that that's a critical mission-driven piece of every institution to increase student learning and ultimately for their own professional development as well. Three, it increases opportunity for students in these communities to be college ready, when they get to your institution or whatever institution they're going to, which saves lots of money in terms of avoiding redundancy, in terms of basic skills and adaptability and performance and readiness in the institution. It also improves accreditation of profiles for institutions, which means a lot during this age. It increases grants and gifts in dramatic ways. It increases reputation. So I could go on and on and on. In the book, I sort of make a case for this, that in fact, it's in the naked self-interest of institutions of higher education and presidents and leaders of institutions and boards of trustees and regents and the like to understand that. If they think that, well, we want to do this politically, we want to do this socially, we want to do this morally, but we just can't find the resources, it's absolutely critical that they do find the resources to build their own enrollment bases, if nothing else, and the success of those students when they get there. Not to mention that they become remarkable alumni committed to that institution, like Nyeema as case one, right? Where you are so dedicated to that institution because it was a piece of your own transformation, an important anchor in your own life. And that's invaluable to institutions of higher education. So I think in sustaining the work, we have to realize what the case is, first of all. And secondly, I like the notion, and that's why I framed it as neighborhood democracy. I like the notion of committed to place. And committed to place, to me, is beyond just anchors now. It's about really helping these communities develop, flourish, and present themselves fundamentally, politically, and economically within the communities around them. And so that's critical. And that's the whole reconceptualization to neighborhood democracy makes the mission bigger and deeper and more profound. And it links back to the historic civic mission of institutions of building democracy. All of us were founded in some way, shape, or form where we had some commitment to support democracy. And then the last thing I'll just say in terms of an argument that you might get from fellow faculty members, from others in the community, from leaders, regents, trustees, what have you, political leaders, is that, well, higher education should be nonpartisan. Well, higher education at this moment has to be partisans for democracy. There's no such thing as nonpartisan because we're living in a world, we're approaching a world where, in fact, the freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the freedom to pursue scientific questions is being questioned now. And so you can't have a free and open institution of higher education without a vibrant democracy. That relationship now is more evident than ever. So I don't like the notion of nonpartisanship. Listen, I was a president for a long time. I know you have to be strategic, careful. Moment, language, vocabulary matters a lot. Ed Wagner, living in a fairly conservative political community on Staten Island, I never used the term social justice when we talked to our larger community because it didn't mean anything. But if I talked about neighbors helping neighbors, they resonated to that immediately. So you just find the vocabulary that works in your institution, but clearly you have to be strategic and thoughtful in building relationships and understanding the moment you're in. But that said, we have to make the argument that higher ed has to be at the table in terms of the kind of transformation we're talking about and defending and working with these communities. And the last thing I'll just say is this wonderful friend of mine from the 1960s when I was involved in the civil rights movement used to like to say the following: if you're not at the table, you're likely on the menu. Okay? If you're not at the table, you're likely on the menu. And that higher education and these communities, these shadow communities, as allied with higher education, if they're not at the table, they're going to be carved up even more.
I want to jump on that. I want to answer this in like 30 seconds because we got one question that came through, I think, to start us, but we want to encourage others to ask questions. We have about 15 minutes left. This is what I would say about sustainability, just to add, my fellow colleagues here have offered great. A couple is, it's not enough to think about just your individual strategic plan. Today campuses are operating under a multitude of strategic plans. So you have to think about where this work intersects within the capital plan. So if you have a capital campaign plan within your fundraising team, you have to be at the table of thinking about that. Most institutions are operating under kind of a financial fiscal strategic plan. This work matters in terms of local procurement, local hiring, and this connects to the question we have. That is an area of reachable impact for our institutions to say, look, this is going to help all of us, but let's think about that. There's also governance. There have been huge strides in sustaining this work by looking at trustees and boards. A very viable thing to consider is there a committee on this work within your board or trustees? That sort of addition can really make giant leaps forward in sustaining the work that many institutions are open to, because again, this is an area of interest. And the last thing I would say is connect it again to the issues your community is facing. This comes down to fundraising. When you're having conversations around development and fundraising, don't make it about investing in the office or the partnership. Make it about investing our capacity as institutions to make a huge impact in whatever it is, whether that's small business growth, whether that's entrepreneurship, whether that's equity gaps in education. All of these things our institutions have the capacity to do strong work in, and some of it's about reframing. So the first question I want to throw out that we've gotten, but please others send into the chat, is this: as cities suffer from severe disinvestment, where has higher education been? And how can we step up to expand our engaged practice to include deeper economic inclusion work? One quick answer I would say is look at your own house. It's kind of to Francesca's point yesterday, get your own house in order. Mm-hmm. Something you can do off the bat that will open conversations in your campus is looking at your own office's budget. We all purchase supplies, particularly those of engagement are doing a lot of convening. That means we're buying food from a lot of places. How can you think about opportunities within even your own catering vendor to think about, can I purchase from the bakery down the street? Look at your own and do an assessment. How much of your spend is local? How much, look at your hiring practices as well. So I think that's a small place you can start, and then use that as an opening to have bigger conversations across your campus.
I would add to this,
another place to.
Oh, go ahead, Nyeema. No, I want you to go first.
Another place, and then I will credit, the work Bobbie did at Kumu for really getting Rutgers-Camden thinking about our local procurement strategy. But as she said, it's been a long time coming, and it has taken us 4 years to kind of get to this point of rolling out something of significance, of getting the buy-in from business managers. So I absolutely agree with that approach, and saying start now with having those conversations, because it may take a while. But another thing that you have to do is look how you just the physical nature of your campuses, and what are you doing in your communities when you build. What are you building that's going to also be of service to the city that you're situated in? So when we thought about, building our residence halls, we knew we needed to have some retail space. But we built retail space that was not only going to be of service to our campus community, but we surveyed the city around, the neighborhoods around us, to ask, like, what do you need? And that's what we put in the bottoms of our market rate. The bottoms of our dorms, the bottoms of our nursing and science building. They needed a pharmacy. We need a bank. We need like a convenience store. We need more food options. And so also thinking about the retail, the physical assets you have, and what retail can you bring in a way that's going to be beneficial in both areas. And so that's a higher thing to think about. That's why sitting at leadership matters, because you can inject those things and make those key points and decision points. Rich.
Well, I would say, first of all, both points really well made. I think there are two dimensions to how we play a role from our institutions in our local communities and cities and the like. One is the role of direct service that we've just been talking about. How do we provide services? How do we allocate resources, purchasing, and the like, and also direct service that we provide from all the programs we're involved with in health and education and the like. But so there's the direct service piece, and then there's the transformational piece. And for us, working here in and around the Port Richmond community, we've identified the two transformational pieces as economic development and educational opportunity. Those are the life-changing pieces. But you can't do those. Those are necessary, but you can't do those without healthcare committed to this, housing issues, legal services, all the other pieces that go with it that support that kind of work. So the way in which higher ed, I think, can engage is, first of all, as Bobbie was suggesting, and Nyeema, build your own house, build a viable coalition, enter into, it's always tricky, into the political universe, particularly with local electeds. You don't want them to appropriate your organization. They can do that on occasion if you're not careful, but you can use them as allies and friends in careful ways and highlight their work with you, so that you're present at the table politically in agencies where you're not actually members, but where the legislatures and the like. But you need that kind of support. And then finally, something we haven't touched on is the role of the national associations here. There's a whole gallery, I talk about this in the book, of national organizations that are in and around this work. Let me say this about Compact. This is the sweet spot of, this is what Campus Compact does. This is what it does. It does it with students and faculty and staff and presidents and provosts and deans. It does it with all of us. And if we invite more community members into the organization from these partnerships to play a role, I used to bring my community partners to these meetings. As the president, I had the ability to do that, but I would bring the principals and so on and so forth, heads of organizations to the Kumu meetings, the Compact meetings and the like. That's important, I think. But this Compact, this is its sweet spot because I chaired the board of AAC&U, which is a phenomenal organization. Its lane is largely higher education and undergraduate education for the most part. It's wider than that. It's certainly dealing with racial and equity issues in a very profound way. Kumu, as Bobbie knows all too well, is very committed to place and urban and metropolitan relationships and all the manifestations of that. Those are two natural partners. And I could go on to a number of other anchor institutions, Task Force, Project Pericles for a small number of mostly private institutions, on and on and on. There's so many. There's this gallery of institutions that are doing the work, but we need to be brought together into a net. We're not aggregating the leverage we could have nationally, regionally, and locally because we work parallel to one another in a national association as opposed. And I spent all my time as chairing these boards trying to get them to work together. It's hard because they have their own constituencies and funding sources. But I think it's critical for Campus Compact at this moment, not to put too much on Bobbie's plate here, but Compact as a whole. I mean, not just the leadership, all of Compact and all the member institutions and institutions that will belong in the future, to think about how we manifest the civic role of higher education and how, in fact, we bring the national associations together. And Compact, I think, is that organization that can argue this is the only thing we do. So we're not in competition with the others in regard, but we're actually a good mediator and coalition builder, practicing our own arts of democracy, if you will, in this work. And that's critical, I think, because it could present itself nationally in a way in Washington and other places, and regionally in a way that we haven't been able to present the work because we're all sliced up and individualized in our local communities or in our national associations. So that's a big part of sustainability.
Yeah, I think that the thing I would call it on that you just ended with is that we need to be thinking broader about the federal agencies and others that we connect to our work. You know, again, as community engagement professionals and civically engaged institutions, where are we showing up? Not just in HUD. How are we showing up in terms of labor? How are we showing up in terms of economic development and Build Back Better? How are we present and seen as activators for higher education's capacity as we rebuild and renew in many ways in many communities? There was another question that came through that's probably the last one that we're going to have time for, is how can universities and community colleges work together to build neighborhood democracy?
Yeah. Nyeema.
You want to start, Nyeema?
Yeah, and I may throw this over to Rich. I think, you know, coming from the position of a president, it's important. I know for us, you know, especially, you know, we're in very close proximity to our community college. They're right down the street from us, a couple of blocks. So our fates are intertwined with each other. And I think it's thinking intentionally about the work that we do as 2- and 4-year institutions, but uniquely, how do we do that work in the place that we're situated in?
Yeah.
And so how do we align our efforts in a way where they're complementary and not in this space of tension around what are we going to do in the city of Camden to create the pathways for education for everyone? Education equals democracy, democracy equals education to me. So I'm always thinking about how do we get education to the masses? So I think in thinking about the relationships that 4 years have with community colleges, it's how can you increase access and opportunity for those who want to be educated, who want to be trained, and then how do you create pathways moving from one system to another? But I know for both Rutgers and for Camden County College, which is our colleague right down the street, we both have deep commitment to civic life. And engaging our students in that space, understanding where our students are coming from, whether these are working professionals, non-traditionally aged, older adults who are coming back, continuing education, but thinking about what is our role and the place that we're in, and what does that place need. And so it's getting rid of the silos and the egos of being a 2-year to 4-year institution and working in partnership built around the place that we're situated in, and what do our students need as they're entering our doors.
I would just add to
Richard,
that.
if I jump in.
Okay.
Richard, can I jump in and then you can have the last word,
Yeah,
because we're
please.
going to wrap.
Yeah.
So the thing I would say is it's just critical. Community colleges, by the nature of their definition and mission, are at the front lines of this work. And I do think it is imperative that all of higher education, particularly institutions with large endowments that have positions of means and wealth, to think more holistically about our sector. Community colleges have lost on average up to 29% of their enrollment during COVID. Those pipelines affect everyone, and that they are the institutions that are making the difference when we think about the diversification of students getting higher education credentials. I think it's critical also that we open our minds around, as professionals, around how engagement looks in community colleges. They may not have an office of community engagement. How does workforce development lean into this? How's economic development, which are more common structures within community college structures? So I think it's a critical question, and one that Compact, I can say, is very serious about advancing and working on.
Yeah. Last word from me, Bobbie, on this one issue is there is going to be no kind of transformative civic engagement movement without community colleges at the forefront. For all of the reasons you both laid out, they're absolutely critical. They're in a world of hurt. They have bought into, unfortunately, been foisted upon them this notion that their whole sole job is to prepare people for their first job exiting community college, and not seeing themselves as part of, or valuing enough, or being rewarded for valuing enough the civic component of that work. And I think the notion of civic professionalism is a powerful tool, conceptual tool, to use at the community college level. But they are absolutely critical for the work going forward. Thank you.
Well, I think that's it. But Richard, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And it's really powerful. Thank you, everyone.
I hope it's of service. I hope it's of use and service to folks going forward. That's why I wrote it. So thank you so much. It's a great panel.
Wonderful. Okay. Have a great day, everybody, heading into your next sessions.
Thanks.